What would you do if your dignity was stripped from you? Not in a dark alley, but in the bright cabin of an airplane. Imagine sitting in the seat you paid for, ready to fly, only to be told you don't belong there, your presence questioned, your worth diminished, your identity treated like a threat. For sisters Naomi and Lila Carter, a simple flight turned into a national reckoning. A confrontation at 30,000 feet unraveled into something far larger, a battle over respect, equality, and justice. With passengers watching, cameras recording, and tension rising. One phone call to their father, a powerful CEO, changed the course of that flight and, perhaps, the course of their lives. But was it just about two sisters in first class? Or does this moment expose something deeper, an invisible line that still divides, one that millions silently endure every day? This is not just a story about travel. It is a story about truth, courage, and the fight to be seen. If you believe voices like these should never be silenced, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. And now, let's step into the story. The hum of the airport was a familiar kind of chaos. Rolling suitcases bumped against polished floors. Children clutched their parents' hands. Voices echoed over the intercom calling for boarding groups and last-minute gate changes. In the middle of it all, Lila Carter walked with a steady rhythm, her camera bag slung over one shoulder, a boarding pass held carefully in her hand. She was tired but alert, nerves awake with the anticipation of her exhibition waiting in San Francisco. Every photograph she'd chosen for the gallery was a story, a fragment of invisible boundaries and hidden lines she wanted the world to see. But right now, all she wanted was to reach her seat on the plane and breathe beside her. Naomi Carter moved with a different kind of energy. She was tall, confident, carrying herself the way only a lawyer who had spent years in courtrooms could. Her silk blouse and tailored slacks gave her the air of someone used to being listened to, even when the world wanted to ignore her. Naomi kept glancing at her younger sister as they made their way toward the gate, as if silently reminding Lila she wasn't alone in any of this. Their father, Marcus Carter, had walked them to the gate earlier, his presence commanding even in simple travel clothes. He had to step away for a quick call with a client before they boarded, but his words lingered with them both. Keep your heads high, remember who you are, and call me if anything doesn't feel right. At the gate, the announcement came over the intercom. We're now inviting first-class passengers to board. Naomi gave her sister a nod. That's us. The sisters stepped forward, offering their passes to the gate agent. The scanner beeped green. For a moment, everything felt normal. They walked down the jet bridge, the smell of recycled air growing stronger, the echo of rolling carry-ons around them. Inside the aircraft, a flight attendant with carefully pinned blonde hair and a name tag that read Denise Walsh greeted them. But her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone flat. Lila held up her ticket. "We're in first class." Denise's gaze flickered down to the tickets, then back up at the sisters. There was a pause, a hesitation so slight most people wouldn't notice. But Naomi did. She always noticed. "First class," Denise repeated, as if testing the words. "Yes," Naomi said evenly. "Seats 2A and 2B. Another pause. Denise's smile grew tighter. "Of course. Right this way." They followed her down the short aisle, past passengers settling into spacious leather seats. The sisters placed their bags in the overhead bin, sat down, and began to settle. Lila slid her camera bag carefully under the seat in front of her. as if cradling something fragile. Naomi pulled out her tablet, scanning through a legal brief she had promised a client she'd review. But the peace didn't last. Denise reappeared, her hands clasped in front of her. "Excuse me," she said, leaning slightly toward them. "I need to verify your tickets again." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "You scanned them at the gate. They're correct. It's just a routine check," Denise insisted, her voice laced with politeness that felt more like accusation. Lila's chest tightened. She had flown enough times to know what was routine and what wasn't. Something about the way Denise looked at them, the doubt in her eyes. The unspoken question wasn't about procedure. Still, Naomi handed over her ticket. "Here." Denise glanced at it, then at Lila's. She didn't move away. "Instead," she said quietly, "are these really your seats? Did you purchase them?" The words landed like stones. Lila's stomach dropped. She wanted to believe she'd misheard, that maybe Denise had phrased it poorly, but the implication was clear. Naomi sat straighter, her voice steady but edged. "Yes, we purchased them." "Is there a problem?" Denise hesitated, lowering her voice even more. "These seats are reserved for premium travelers. I just need to make sure." Lila felt heat rise to her face. She looked around, noticing a man across the aisle glancing at them curiously. A woman pretending not to listen while clearly eavesdropping. She hated this spotlight, this moment where they weren't just passengers but subjects of suspicion. Naomi didn't flinch. "We are premium travelers," she said firmly. "You've checked our tickets twice now. Unless there's a security issue, I'd suggest we move on." Denise's smile cracked. "I'll need to speak with the purser about this." She walked away quickly, leaving the sisters in stunned silence. Lila leaned toward her sister, whispering, "Why does this always happen? Why is it always us?" Naomi sighed, her jaw tight, because some people still can't reconcile what they see with what they expect. We don't fit their picture of who belongs here. Lila stared down at her lap, fingers brushing against the silver bracelet circling her wrist. Their mother's bracelet, the one engraved with 2 words Evelyn Carter had repeated all her life. Justice always. It was supposed to be a private comfort, a connection of the woman who had taught her to see the world differently. Now it felt like armor. The intercom chimed, boarding continued, families with small children shuffled past, businessmen tucked laptops into side compartments. Every now and then, a pair of eyes lingered on the sisters, curious about why Denise had singled them out. When Denise returned, she wasn't alone. Another flight attendant trailed behind her, and together they spoke in hushed voices just out of earshot. Naomi's lips pressed into a thin line. She could already sense where this was going. Lila swallowed hard. "Naomi, what if they try to move us?" Naomi turned to her sister, her voice low but steady. "Then we decide how we respond. But whatever happens, you're not alone. We face it together." The tension was sharp enough to cut through the hum of boarding. What should have been an ordinary flight to San Francisco was already turning into something else, something heavier. A test of belonging, a confrontation they hadn't asked for but couldn't avoid. Lila exhaled slowly, gripping the armrest. She had wanted tonight to be about her photographs, about light and shadow, about invisible lines captured on camera. She hadn't realized those lines would find her here, on this plane, before the journey even began. And as Denise leaned toward them again, with that practiced smile that hid more than it revealed, Lila knew the evening ahead would be more complicated than she had ever imagined. The plane had nearly finished boarding when Denise returned. Her smile had hardened into something almost brittle. She carried a small tablet in her hand, the kind flight attendants used to check passenger manifests. She paused at the end of row 2 and tilted the screen toward Naomi and Lila as though presenting evidence. "Ladies," she began, her voice pitched louder than necessary, "I need to confirm once more that these seats belong to you." Several heads turned at the words. A man across the aisle lowered his newspaper. A young couple behind them glanced up from their phones. Naomi felt the shift in the cabin air, the subtle prickle of collective attention. This was no longer private. It was spectacle. Naomi kept her voice even. "We have already shown you our tickets. Twice." Denise's smile faltered. "Sometimes there are errors in the system. It happens." Lila felt her chest tighten. She wanted to shrink into the leather seat, to disappear into the hum of the air vents. Instead, she pressed her fingers against her bracelet, grounding herself in the cool metal. Naomi leaned slightly forward. "If there is an error, it's not ours. You scanned our tickets at the gate. We passed security like everyone else. Why are we being questioned repeatedly?" Denise's cheeks flushed. "I'm simply doing my job." Naomi's voice dropped lower. "Doing your job should not mean singling out 2 passengers because they don't look like who you expected in first class." The words hung heavy between them. Denise stiffened, glanced around as if checking who had overheard. Several passengers looked away quickly, but the damage was done. The tension was visible now, undeniable. Denise pressed her lips together, then muttered, "I'll be right back." She disappeared toward the galley. Lila exhaled shakily. "Naomi, maybe we should just let it go. If they want to move us, it's not worth it. I don't want trouble." Her sister turned sharply, eyes fierce but gentle. "Lila, you have an exhibition tonight. You've worked years for this. You deserve to sit here as much as anyone. If we stay silent, we tell them they can treat us like intruders in our own country. Is that what Mom would want?" Lila's throat tightened at the mention of Evelyn. Their mother's voice echoed in her memory, calm and resolute. Invisible lines only grow stronger when you pretend not to see them. Before she could reply, Denise returned with a tall man in a navy blazer. His name tag read Purser. His expression was carefully neutral, but his tone carried authority. "Good evening," he said. "I understand there's some confusion about your seating." "No," Naomi answered firmly. "There is no confusion. We purchased these seats, we checked in, our tickets scanned without issue. The only confusion seems to be why we are being questioned over and over again." The purser shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Denise, then back at the sisters. "Sometimes mistakes occur with upgrades. It's possible someone else was assigned." Naomi cut him off. "Show me the manifest." The man blinked. "Excuse me, you said there may be a mistake. Show me the seating chart. Who else is supposed to be here?" He hesitated, then tapped at the tablet Denise held. After a moment, he looked up. According to the system, seats 2A and 2B are assigned to Naomi Carter and Lila Carter. The silence that followed was sharp. Denise shifted her weight, her cheeks burning. The purser cleared his throat. "Well, there you have it. Thank you for your patience." He handed back their tickets and motioned for Denise to follow him toward the front of the cabin. As soon as they left, the man across the aisle spoke up, his voice tinged with curiosity. What was that about Naomi didn't answer? She focused on her tablet, trying to steady her breathing. Lila looked down, ashamed of the attention, though she knew she hadn't done anything wrong. The boarding announcement crackled through the speakers. Cabin crew, prepare for departure. But the sisters knew it wasn't over. Not yet. As the plane pushed back from the gate, Lila closed her eyes, trying to find calm in the vibration of the engines. She thought about her photographs, about how every frame captured tension and silence, the space between what people show and what they hide. She hadn't expected to become part of that story tonight. Naomi glanced at her sister, noting the way Lila gripped her bracelet like a lifeline. She reached over and gently squeezed her hand. "We're okay," she whispered. "No matter what, we're okay." But her own stomach churned. She had seen this pattern before. It rarely ended cleanly. Moments later, Denise returned yet again, this time her voice lower, almost conspiratorial. "I've spoken with the purser. We need to reconfirm your identification with the captain before takeoff. Please have your passports ready." Naomi's jaw dropped. "This is harassment. We've provided everything required. There is no legitimate reason for this." Denise's eyes flickered with something unsteady, a mix of stubbornness and doubt. "I'm just following protocol." Naomi stood, her voice calm but edged with steel. "Then, I want the captain here. Now." The cabin grew still. A child across the aisle stopped fussing. Even the hum of the engines felt quieter. Passengers stared openly now, waiting to see what would happen. The purser reappeared, clearly uncomfortable. "Is there a problem?" Naomi met his eyes. "Yes, we are being singled out without cause. We've complied with every request, and still your attendant insists on questioning our right to be here. This is unacceptable." The purser shifted, looking around at the watching passengers. He lowered his voice. "Please, sit down. Let me handle this. We'll speak with the captain." Naomi remained standing for a beat longer, then slowly sat. Lila's heart raced, her palms damp. She hated confrontation, but she also knew her sister was right. If they surrendered now, they'd regret it forever. Minutes passed in uneasy silence. Finally, the purser returned. His tone was clipped. "The captain will not be leaving the cockpit. We'll address this after takeoff. For now, please remain seated." Naomi's lips pressed into a thin line. Lila leaned closer. "Should we call Dad?" she whispered. Naomi considered it. Marcus Carter had told them to reach out if anything went wrong. He had the kind of influence that could bring a corporation to its knees. But calling him would escalate everything. Were they ready for that? Her sister's eyes searched hers, filled with fear and frustration. Naomi thought of their mother again, of the endless times Evelyn had told them that silence was complicity. She thought of the passengers watching, some sympathetic, others impatient. She thought of Lila's exhibition, the photographs of invisible boundaries, and how ironic it was that they were being drawn into one right now. Naomi nodded slowly. "Yes, call him." Lila pulled out her phone with trembling hands. She found her father's name, pressed dial, and held it to her ear. The line clicked, and Marcus's deep voice answered. "Dad," she whispered, her throat tight. "We need you." Marcus Carter's voice came through the phone with the kind of calm authority that had carried him through decades of boardrooms and negotiation tables. "Lila, what's wrong? You sound shaken." Her throat tightened as she tried to explain, but Naomi took the phone gently from her. "Dad, it's Naomi. They've questioned us 3 times about our seats. Denise, one of the attendants, keeps insisting there's a problem. even after the purser confirmed the manifest. She's pushing to see our passports. Passengers are staring. This is harassment. For a long moment, the only sound was the murmur of boarding announcements in the background and the low hum of the plane's ventilation system. Then Marcus spoke. His voice clipped, each word deliberate. "Stay calm. Do not raise your voices. Keep the phone on speaker." Naomi obeyed, placing the phone on the center console between their seats. Marcus's presence filled the small space, invisible but commanding. "I want the senior-most person in charge of this flight to come to my daughters immediately. If they refuse, you tell them Marcus Carter asked. That will be enough." Lila glanced around nervously. Several passengers were openly watching now, some with curiosity, others with suspicion. A woman 2 rows behind shook her head as if annoyed at the delay, but across the aisle, an older woman with silver hair and a pearl necklace gave them a small nod of encouragement, her eyes kind. Naomi whispered to her sister, "We're not alone in this." Denise returned, arms crossed, irritation plain on her face. "Ladies, I've spoken to the captain. We cannot depart until this is resolved." Naomi leaned forward, her voice calm but cutting. "Then bring the captain here, or bring your operations manager. We have someone on the phone who needs to speak with them." Denise hesitated, her composure faltering at Naomi's tone. "Who exactly is on the phone?" Marcus's voice carried clearly from the speaker. "This is Marcus Carter. I suggest you escalate this immediately." Denise blinked, momentarily thrown. She glanced at the purser, who had reappeared by her side, clearly uncomfortable with the growing attention. He leaned closer to listen. Then his expression shifted as recognition dawned. The name meant something to him. "Mr. Carter," the purser said into the phone, his voice deferential. "This is Daniel Moore, the purser on this flight. I assure you, we're working to resolve the situation now." Marcus interrupted, his voice unyielding. "You're working to humiliate my daughters. I want this addressed by your ground operations director before that plane leaves the gate." The purser flushed, glancing around at the curious passengers. "Sir, that may delay our departure." "Then delay it," Marcus snapped. "Better a delayed flight than a lawsuit and a public scandal." The cabin buzzed with whispers. Someone muttered, "What's going on?" while another passenger raised a phone, angling it toward the sisters. Lila's stomach turned. She hated being recorded like this, her private moment of indignity becoming public fodder. Yet part of her understood the necessity. Visibility was protection, even when it felt like exposure. Naomi sat straighter, her hands folded neatly in her lap, as if she were in a courtroom. "You heard him," she said. "Escalate it." The purser and Denise retreated to the galley, leaving the sisters in tense silence. Lila leaned closer to her sister, whispering, "Are we making this worse? What if people think we're overreacting?" Naomi's gaze softened. "Lila, this isn't about comfort. It's about dignity. Remember what Mom always said? Invisible lines only disappear when someone is brave enough to step across them." Lila swallowed hard, blinking back tears. She wanted to believe her sister, but the weight of so many eyes pressing on her made it hard. She fiddled with her bracelet, the engraved words cool against her skin. "Justice always." The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We're experiencing a short delay due to a seating issue. We appreciate your patience." Groans filled the cabin. A man in a business suit muttered loudly, "Unbelievable." Some people just can't follow the rules. His words weren't directed at anyone in particular, but his gaze flickered toward the sisters, and the implication stung. Naomi turned her head sharply, her eyes locking onto his. The rules are being followed. The problem is the assumptions about who belongs here. The man scoffed and returned to his laptop, but the message had landed. Meanwhile, Marcus's voice continued from the phone. "Girls, listen to me. This is bigger than this flight. You are standing in the same place your mother once stood, choosing whether to be silent or to speak. Do not shrink. Do not let them reduce you." Lila closed her eyes, hearing Evelyn's voice and her father's. She felt a flicker of strength. Maybe she didn't want to be here, in this fight, in this spotlight, but maybe she needed to be, after what felt like an eternity. The purser returned, flanked by Denise and another uniformed attendant. His tone was clipped, professional. "We've been instructed by ground operations to hold the aircraft until this is resolved. Management is on their way to the gate." A ripple of irritation spread through the cabin. A woman muttered about missing her connection. Someone else sighed loudly, but a different voice spoke up, calm and firm. Good for them. The silver-haired woman across the aisle said, "It's about time someone challenged this nonsense." The cabin went quiet again. Denise's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Naomi leaned toward the woman. "Thank you." The woman gave a small nod. "I was a judge for 30 years. I know what bias looks like, even when it's dressed in protocol." Lila felt a rush of gratitude. For the first time since boarding, she didn't feel entirely alone. The purser tried again to calm the crowd. "We'll update you as soon as possible. Please remain seated." As he moved away, Naomi whispered to Lila, "See, even strangers can see the truth. We're not imagining this." Lila nodded, though the knot in her stomach remained. She stared at the dark window beside her, her reflection faint against the glass. For a fleeting moment, she imagined her mother sitting there, hand resting on hers, whispering courage into her ear. The minutes dragged on. Passengers fidgeted, scrolling through phones, whispering in hushed tones. Some cast sympathetic glances, others looked away, uncomfortable with the confrontation unfolding in such close quarters. Naomi leaned toward the phone. "Dad, they're bringing management here. What should we do if they try to remove us?" Marcus's voice was steady as stone. "You do not move. You do not leave those seats. You belong there as much as anyone else. If they try to touch you, that's assault, and I'll have the entire airline in court before sunrise." Naomi exhaled slowly. "Understood." Lila bit her lip, her heart pounding. She wasn't sure if she felt protected or terrified by her father's unwavering certainty. She wanted to be brave, but bravery felt heavy tonight. The cabin door opened. 2 uniformed airline managers stepped inside, their expressions taut, aware that every passenger's eyes were on them. Phones were raised discreetly or not so discreetly recording. The story was no longer confined to this cabin. It was already spilling into the world beyond, and Lila knew, as the managers began their slow walk down the aisle toward them, that this was only the beginning. The 2 managers moved down the aisle with the solemn gravity of people who understood they were stepping into a storm. Their navy blazers were crisp, their ID badges gleamed under the cabin lights, and their eyes carried the weight of both authority and discomfort. One of them, a woman with sharp features and a clipped bob haircut, stopped in front of Naomi and Lila's row. "Good evening. I'm Claire Donovan, Senior Vice President of Customer Experience. This is Anthony Brooks, Vice President of Flight Operations. The passengers stirred, whispers rippling through the cabin. Naomi noticed the subtle shift in posture, the way everyone leaned closer as though sensing history pressing into this moment. Naomi kept her voice calm. "I'm Naomi Carter. This is my sister Lila. We purchased these seats. We've been repeatedly questioned and harassed by your crew. The manifest confirmed our names, yet we're still being treated as though we don't belong." Claire's expression was neutral but strained. "We were contacted by the purser regarding a passenger concern." Marcus's voice boomed from the phone on the console. "This is Marcus Carter, their father, and I want to know exactly why my daughters are being harassed when your own manifest shows they are in the correct seats." Claire's eyes flicked to the phone, then back to Naomi. "Mr. Carter, I assure you, we're here to resolve this matter professionally." Marcus didn't soften. Professionally would have meant never escalating it this far. "I run a Fortune 500 company. Ms. Donovan, if my daughters were white, we would not be having this conversation. I want that acknowledged before we proceed." A hush fell over the cabin. The word white hung in the air like a flare, impossible to ignore. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably, others nodded subtly, their faces registering recognition. Anthony Brooks cleared his throat. He was a tall black man in his early 50s, his voice carrying a quiet resonance. "Mr. Carter, I can't speak for the crew's actions, but I will say this. I've been in aviation for 30 years, and I know what bias looks like. I won't dismiss your concern." Naomi felt a flicker of gratitude. At least one of them was willing to speak plainly. Claire shot Anthony a quick glance, but kept her composure. "Let's move forward. Ms. Carter, Miss Carter, if you're willing, I'd like to see your identification. Once confirmed, we can end this matter." Naomi's eyes narrowed. "We've complied with every request. The manifest already shows our names. Why should we provide more than any other passenger in this cabin?" Claire's tone remained measured. "Because the situation has escalated. This is about reassurance." Naomi's lips pressed into a thin line. "Reassurance for whom? The passengers who've been glaring at us, or the crew who can't accept that two black women could possibly belong in first class?" The air in the cabin thickened, tension pulling it tight. Lila sat rigid, her fingers locked around her bracelet. She hated confrontation, hated the eyes boring into her, but she felt the truth of her sister's words thrumming in her bones. Marcus's voice came sharp through the speaker. "Claire Donovan, I suggest you consider the optics of what you're asking. Two women of color, repeatedly questioned, publicly humiliated, now being asked for extra identification when no one else has been asked the same. Do you know how this looks? Do you understand how fast this will go viral? From somewhere in the back of the cabin." A phone camera clicked loudly. Claire stiffened. She knew. Anthony Brooks shifted his weight, his gaze steady on Naomi. "Ms. Carter, you shouldn't have to prove what's already proven. I see that. But if you let us check your ID, I can guarantee this will end tonight. Not because you owe it, but because it exposes how ridiculous this process has become." Naomi looked at him for a long moment. She read something in his eyes, weariness, maybe, or solidarity. The quiet understanding of a man who had fought invisible battles in boardrooms, in cockpits, in places where his competence was always questioned twice. Slowly, She reached into her bag and pulled out her passport. She opened it and held it up, steady and unflinching. This is who I am. It has always been who I am. The problem isn't with this document. The problem is with the assumptions you made before even asking for it. Claire glanced at the passport, then at Lila's when she reluctantly offered hers. After a quick nod, Claire handed them back. Thank you. That settles the matter. Naomi's laugh was bitter, low. Settles the matter. You've already unsettled an entire cabin, delayed a flight, and humiliated us in public. Settling would mean an apology. The cabin was silent. Even the impatient businessman across the aisle lowered his eyes, as though conceding the point. Claire hesitated, then said softly, I apologize for any distress caused. Naomi's voice sharpened. Not distress, injustice. Say the word. Claire's jaw tightened. For a moment, it seemed she might refuse. But then, perhaps sensing the cameras still pointed in their direction, she relented. I apologize for the injustice you've experienced tonight. The words landed heavy in the cabin. Naomi leaned back, satisfied but unsmiling. Lila felt her chest loosen just slightly, though her eyes burned with unshed tears. Marcus spoke once more from the phone. Ms. Donovan, Mr. Brooks, I expect a full written report on this incident before my daughters land. If I don't receive it, I'll have no choice but to escalate directly to your board of directors. Do I make myself clear? Claire's voice was taut, crystal clear. Good, Marcus said. Now let that plane take off. The managers exchanged a look, then turned to leave. Denise lingered for a moment, her face pale and tight, before disappearing into the galley. As the cabin settled again, the intercom crackled. Cabin crew, prepare for departure. The engines roared louder, the plane inching toward the runway. Naomi exhaled, the tension finally leaving her shoulders. She reached for Lila's hand, squeezing it gently. We did it. We held our ground. Lila nodded, though her heart was still pounding. I didn't want to fight, but I'm glad we didn't back down. Naomi looked at her with quiet pride. That's the thing about justice. It rarely shows up when it's convenient, but if you wait for convenience, it never comes at all. The silver-haired woman across the aisle, Margaret Sinclair, leaned forward. Your mother would be proud. I didn't know her, but I know strength when I see it passed down. Lila smiled faintly, blinking back tears. Thank you. The engines roared as the plane lifted into the night sky. Outside the window, city lights glittered like scattered stars. Inside, the sisters sat side by side, weary but unbowed, their father's voice still echoing in their ears, their mother's memory pressed close to their hearts. And though the confrontation had ended for now, both sisters knew the story wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. The plane climbed steadily into the night, but the cabin remained heavy, as though the confrontation had left a residue no amount of altitude could thin. The hum of the engines pressed against the walls of silence. People shifted in their seats, whispering low enough to pretend privacy, but loud enough for fragments to float into the sisters' ears. Naomi sat upright, her posture impeccable, her breathing deliberate. She was trained for moments like this, though never on an airplane and never with her younger sister beside her. Years in courtrooms had taught her the importance of composure. Her voice in her own head reminded her every gesture is testimony, every look becomes evidence. Lila, by contrast, felt like her skin was on fire. She could not stop hearing the muttered comments from the man across the aisle. The sighs of the passengers who thought of this as an inconvenience rather than an injustice. Her fingers twisted the bracelet again and again, as though its engraved words might rewrite the moment. She leaned closer to her sister. "Do you think this will follow us off the plane?" Naomi's lips barely moved. "It already has. There are videos." Lila's stomach dropped. She imagined herself plastered across the internet, captured mid-tier, frozen in someone else's narrative. She hated the thought, hated the exposure, yet she also knew the truth stories without witnesses faded. And maybe their mother's voice had been right all along. Visibility could be a weapon. From the front of the cabin, Margaret Sinclair turned slightly in her seat. Her voice carried the steady cadence of someone who had spent decades commanding silence in a courtroom. "Ignore them," she said softly. "Let them whisper. They can't rewrite what just happened." Naomi offered a small nod of thanks. Lila wanted to believe her, but her nerves pulsed with doubt. The captain's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are now at cruising altitude. Please relax and enjoy the service." His tone was smooth, practiced, utterly detached from the storm that had nearly kept the plane on the ground. Denise reappeared, stiff-backed, holding a tray. Without meeting Naomi's eyes, she placed 2 glasses of sparkling water on their console. "Compliments of the cabin," she said, her words clipped. Naomi regarded the glasses coolly. "Water won't erase what you did." Denise flushed, then retreated before Naomi could say more. Lila whispered, "You didn't have to say that." "Yes, I did," Naomi answered. Her voice even. "Silence is how these things get buried." For a while, they sat in quiet, each lost in thought. Naomi replayed her father's voice in her mind, his authority slicing through the cabin. She knew Marcus Carter's reputation was formidable, but hearing him intervene so directly reminded her just how much power he wielded. She also knew he had been shaped by battles she herself had never witnessed, the boardrooms where he was the only black man in a sea of white faces. The negotiations where respect had to be carved out rather than offered. Lila's thoughts drifted elsewhere, to the gallery waiting for her photographs. She imagined the prints hanging in clean white space, images of invisible borders in everyday life. Tonight's ordeal felt like it belonged in that collection, a photograph never taken but already etched into memory. Around them, the cabin revealed its fractures. A man 2 rows ahead leaned toward his companion, muttering, "This is what happens when people make everything about race." His voice wasn't meant to carry, but it did. Naomi ignored him. Lila clenched her fists. Then another voice spoke, firmer. "Maybe you should think about why it keeps coming up." It was Charles Benton, a middle-aged attorney seated a few rows back. He had watched quietly until now, his face unreadable. Now he leaned into the aisle, his eyes fixed on the muttering man. Silence doesn't mean fairness. Sometimes it means fear. The man scoffed, but said nothing further. Naomi's gaze flicked toward Benton, a small nod of acknowledgement. Allies appeared in unexpected places. The attendants began meal service. Their smiles stretched thin, their movements efficient but brittle. Denise avoided the sisters' row entirely, sending Adrian Flores, another attendant. Instead, he bent down slightly, his voice low. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry. Not for them, for how you were treated. It wasn't right." Naomi studied him, measuring sincerity. "Thank you," she said simply. Lila added softly. "Thank you for saying something at all." Adrian gave a brief nod, then moved on. Small gestures mattered, Naomi thought. They didn't erase the wound, but they reminded her not everyone was complicit. As the meal service continued, Naomi pulled out her tablet, pretending to read but really gathering her thoughts. She thought of writing a statement, of contacting her firm's public relations team, of preparing for what would come once they landed. Cases were built from moments like this: evidence, witnesses, context. She was already piecing it together in her mind. Beside her, Lila closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. She imagined her mother again, Evelyn's calm smile, the softness of her hands when she used to braid Lila's hair. She heard her voice whispering, "Invisible lines can cut deepest when you deny they exist. Don't let them cut you. Cut through them." Her eyes opened. She reached for Naomi's hand. "I think Mom would be proud." Naomi's grip tightened. "I hope so." The cabin lights dimmed. Passengers settled into movies, books, restless naps, but the sisters remained alert, their thoughts heavy with what had unfolded. Naomi found herself watching the other passengers, cataloging their reactions, the curious glances, the sympathetic nods, the averted eyes. Each one told its own story about how people responded when injustice unfolded inches away. At one point, Margaret leaned across the aisle again. "When I was on the bench," she said quietly, "I used to remind juries that silence was also a verdict. Tonight, some of your fellow passengers stayed silent, but some of us won't. If you need a witness, I'll stand for you." Naomi felt a swell of gratitude. "Thank you, Judge Sinclair." Margaret smiled faintly. "Retired, dear, but some habits never leave you." The sisters exchanged a look, for the first time since boarding. Naomi felt a sliver of hope, not just in her father's power, but in the strangers willing to risk discomfort for truth. Still, the journey ahead loomed. Naomi knew the airline would try to contain this, to smooth it over with apologies and vouchers, to bury the deeper truth under corporate language. But she also knew something fundamental had shifted. The story was already beyond containment. It would leave the cabin, spill into headlines, stir conversations in living rooms and offices. As the hours stretched on, Lila finally drifted into uneasy sleep, her head resting against the cool window. Naomi remained awake, staring into the dark. She thought about her closing arguments in court, about the weight of words, about the responsibility of voice. She realized tonight had not just been about defending a seat. It had been about defending a place in the world. And as the plane sliced through the night sky, Naomi vowed silently that she would not let the story end at landing. Justice had to travel further than this flight. The cabin was dark now, washed in the dim glow of overhead lights. Outside, the endless stretch of sky pressed against the windows, moonlight flickering on the curve of the wing. Most passengers had slipped into restless half-sleep, their heads tilted awkwardly against headrests, their breathing steady. But for Naomi and Lila, sleep felt impossible. The quiet hum of the engines was suddenly interrupted by a jolt. The plane shuddered, trays rattled, and someone gasped loudly from the back. A voice from the cockpit came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've hit a patch of turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." The plane dipped again, a sharp sway that pulled a gasp from Lila's throat. She pressed her hand against the window, as if touching the outside would stabilize her. "I hate turbulence," she whispered, her voice trembling. Naomi reached for her sister's hand. Breathe. It's normal. But inside, Naomi felt the same surge of unease. She wasn't afraid of flying, but after everything that had happened tonight, the turbulence felt like a cruel metaphor, the whole flight shaking under the weight of tension that hadn't yet settled. The overhead bins rattled as the plane jolted again. Somewhere, a glass clinked to the floor and shattered. Denise's voice rang out, sharp but strained. "Cabin crew, take your seats immediately." The attendants scrambled, buckling in wherever they could. Adrian, seated a few rows down, caught Naomi's eye briefly before focusing forward, his jaw tight. The turbulence worsened, sending another ripple of panic through the cabin. A child began to cry. Someone muttered a prayer under their breath. Naomi sat perfectly still, her hand gripping Lila's so tightly her knuckles whitened. Inside her head, her mother's voice returned, soft and steady. "Storms pass, Naomi. They always do, but they leave you different." Lila pressed her forehead against Naomi's shoulder. "Why does it feel like this flight is cursed?" Naomi didn't answer right away. She felt the truth of her sister's words. First, the confrontation, now the storm. It felt as though the universe was conspiring to test them, shaking every layer of composure they had left. The plane jolted violently, and several passengers cried out. The seatbelt sign blinked red above their heads, as if shouting a command. Naomi inhaled deeply, willing herself to remain calm for Lila's sake. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the turbulence eased, the plane leveled, the shuddering subsided. The engines roared smoothly again, steady and reassuring. A collective sigh of relief passed through the cabin. Nervous laughter bubbled up from somewhere in the back. The child who had been crying hiccuped into silence, soothed by a parent's murmur. Naomi loosened her grip on Lila's hand. "See, it's over." Lila pulled back slightly, her face pale. "I know, but it felt like more than turbulence." Naomi studied her sister's expression. She understood. For both of them. The storm inside the cabin had already blurred into the storm outside. From across the aisle, Margaret Sinclair leaned forward again. Her pearl necklace caught the dim light, glowing faintly. "You did well," she said softly. In the face of fear, staying steady is its own kind of victory. Naomi nodded politely, but Margaret wasn't finished. "You know, turbulence reminds me of justice. People think it's linear, smooth, predictable, but in truth, it comes in sudden drops, violent shakes. The question isn't whether turbulence will come, it's how you respond when it does." Her words sank deep. Naomi found herself holding them like a stone in her pocket, heavy but grounding. As the cabin lights brightened slightly, the attendants began moving again, collecting debris. Adrian approached their row with quiet care. "Everyone all right here?" "Yes," Naomi said. Lila added softly, "Just shaken." Adrian gave them a small smile. "That's normal. Planes are built for worse than that. You'd be surprised how resilient they are." His eyes lingered on them for a moment. People, too. He moved on, but the weight of his words remained. Naomi turned to Lila. "You hear that resilient?" Lila tried to smile, though her eyes glistened. "I want to believe it. You don't have to want to. You just have to live it," Naomi said gently. The sisters sat in silence for a while, the hum of the engines steady again. Naomi watched the reflection of her face in the window, superimposed over the dark expanse of sky. She wondered what people would see when they looked back on this night. Would they see two women who had held their ground, or two passengers who had delayed a flight? Would they see troublemakers or truth-tellers? Her thoughts drifted to her father. She imagined him pacing his study at home, phone still in hand, fury simmering just below his polished exterior. She could picture the rows of law books on his shelves, the framed photographs of boardroom victories, the plaque from her mother's Community Justice Award that he kept prominently displayed. He was a man who understood the cost of visibility, yet he had never let it deter him. Tonight, she realized, he had passed that lesson to them. Lila's voice broke the silence. "Naomi, do you ever get tired of it? Tired of what always having to fight? Always being on guard? Always proving that we belong?" Naomi's throat tightened. She wanted to tell her sister that it got easier, that the victories accumulated until the battles mattered less. But that would be a lie. The truth was, the exhaustion never fully left. It clung like a second skin. "Yes," Naomi admitted quietly, "but tired doesn't mean defeated, and you're not fighting alone." Lila's eyes filled, and she nodded, gripping her sister's hand again. The turbulence had ended, but the emotional storm lingered. Passengers settled back into the illusion of normalcy. But Naomi knew nothing was normal anymore. Tonight had revealed too much about the airline, about the passengers, about themselves. The plane flew on, a metal capsule slicing through the night, carrying not just bodies but stories. Naomi understood now that theirs was no longer just a personal ordeal. It was already bigger, already echoing beyond the walls of the cabin, and somewhere deep in her chest, beneath the fatigue and the anger, she felt the first stirrings of resolve hardening into purpose. The cabin was quiet again, but Naomi could not sleep. Lila's head rested against her shoulder, her breathing soft and uneven, like a child drifting in and out of dreams. Naomi watched her sister's reflection in the window, the curve of her cheek illuminated by the faint glow from the aisle. She looked peaceful, but Naomi knew better. Peace, in their world, was often fragile. Naomi let her own eyes close, but instead of sleep, memories surged forward. She was back in her childhood home, the smell of Sunday dinner drifting from the kitchen, the sound of jazz records spinning softly in the background. Their mother, Evelyn Carter, stood at the counter in her apron, chopping vegetables with a rhythm that sounded almost like music. Naomi had been 10 years old then, already brimming with questions about why the world seemed to treat her father differently from the fathers of her classmates. She remembered asking Evelyn why the store clerk had followed them down the aisles that afternoon, why his eyes had been sharp and suspicious even though they bought nothing unusual. Evelyn had set down her knife, wiped her hands on her apron, and crouched so she could look Naomi directly in the eye. Because, baby, sometimes people see your skin before they see your soul, and when they do, they make judgments that have nothing to do with who you are. Naomi had frowned. "So what do we do?" Her mother's smile had been calm, steady, like the anchor in a storm. "We don't let them decide who we are. We show them anyway. And when showing isn't enough, we fight, not with fists, with truth." Naomi opened her eyes again. The words lingered with her even now, floating like lanterns in the dark. She had built her entire career on that lesson on fighting with truth, wielding words as her weapon, and tonight, on this airplane. Evelyn's wisdom had guided her again. Lila stirred beside her, murmuring softly, as if caught in her own memory. Naomi brushed a hand against her sister's hair, comforting her the way Evelyn once had comforted them both. When Lila's eyes opened, she whispered, "I was dreaming about Mom." Naomi smiled faintly. So was I. She was standing in the gallery. Lila continued, her voice still drowsy. Looking at my photographs, she didn't say anything, but she looked proud, like she understood what I was trying to capture. Naomi felt a lump rise in her throat. She would be proud. Lila, you capture what people try to ignore. That's what she always taught us. Lila's eyes shimmered in the low light. Do you think she would have handled tonight differently? Naomi thought about that for a long moment. No, she said finally. She would have spoken with grace, but she wouldn't have backed down. Mom never confused politeness with silence. The memory of Evelyn was so vivid it was almost unbearable. Naomi remembered another night, years ago, when a teacher had accused Lila of plagiarizing an essay. The words were too sophisticated, the ideas too mature. Instead of asking questions, the teacher had simply assumed a black child could not possibly have written something so insightful. Naomi had been furious, ready to storm into the school herself, but Evelyn had gone instead. She had walked into the principal's office with Lila's essay in one hand and a stack of her notebooks in the other. She had calmly laid them out, one by one, showing page after page of Lila's handwriting, her ideas, her brilliance. She had ended with a single sentence, "Don't you ever underestimate my daughter again." Naomi remembered the silence in that office. She remembered the shame on the teacher's face, and she remembered the pride that radiated from her mother, a pride that still echoed in their bones. "Back in the cabin," Lila whispered. "I miss her so much." "I do too," Naomi admitted. "But she's here. Every time we stand up, every time we refuse to let someone else define us, she's here." The plane rumbled softly, steady now, no longer jostled by turbulence. Naomi glanced around the cabin. Most passengers were asleep. Margaret was reading quietly, her glasses perched low on her nose. Charles Benton sat with his laptop open, typing furiously, perhaps already drafting something about what he had witnessed. Adrian moved quietly down the aisle, checking on passengers with a gentle efficiency. Naomi felt a strange sense of duality on the surface. The flight was calm, but beneath it, currents of memory, grief, and determination flowed stronger than ever. She closed her eyes again and let herself drift deeper into memory. This time she was at Evelyn's memorial service. The church had been filled to overflowing. People had spoken about her kindness, her strength, the way she had fought for children in their community, the way she had never wavered in her belief that justice was worth the fight. Naomi remembered standing at the podium, barely able to speak, her hands trembling as she clutched her notes. But then she had looked at her father in the front row, his face carved with grief but his back straight, and she had found her voice. She had told the room that her mother was not gone, not really, that she lived on in every fight for fairness, every refusal to accept less than dignity. Now, years later, Naomi realized those words had been more than comfort. They had been a prophecy. Evelyn truly was with them, shaping them even tonight. She turned to her sister again. "Do you remember what Mom engraved on that bracelet?" Lila looked down at her wrist, her fingers brushing the silver. "Justice always." "That's not just a phrase," Naomi said softly. "It's a promise. To her, to ourselves." For a long moment, the sisters sat in silence, their mother's presence filling the quiet space between them. Then Lila said, her voice trembling but sure, Naomi, I don't want to just survive nights like this. I want to change them. I want to use my photographs to show people what it feels like. Not just what it looks like, but what it feels like to live through it. Naomi's chest swelled with pride. Then do it. That's your power. Mine is the courtroom. Yours is the camera. Together, we carry her fight forward. Lila nodded, her resolve hardening. Justice always. Naomi echoed the words, her voice barely above a whisper. Justice always, as the plane cut smoothly through the sky. It felt, for a moment, as though Evelyn herself was carrying them forward, her spirit stitched into the night, guiding them through both storms and silence. The stillness of the cabin was deceptive, like the pause between thunder and lightning. Passengers had settled into uneasy rest, but tension lingered, woven into the air like static. Naomi could feel it pressing against her skin. She had learned to sense when tempers had not truly cooled, when conflict waited like a spark near dry kindling. It came sooner than she expected. From the second row of first class, the businessman who had muttered earlier shifted in his seat, his voice carrying just enough to be heard. You know what's really unfair? That the rest of us had to sit through that spectacle because two women couldn't just cooperate. Naomi's eyes opened slowly. She turned her head toward him, her voice calm but edged with steel. We did cooperate. The problem wasn't us. The man snorted, always playing the victim, always making everything about race. Some of us just want to get where we're going without a political lecture. Lila stirred, her eyes flashing open. Excuse me, she said, her voice sharp with disbelief. The man leaned back in his seat, but his words carried. You heard me. You two caused a scene. People like you thrive on drama. Gasps whispered through the cabin. Margaret Sinclair lowered her book, her gaze cutting toward him like a judge assessing a defendant. Charles Benton closed his laptop slowly, his jaw tight. Adrian, further down the aisle, froze in place, his tray half raised. Naomi rose slightly from her seat, not enough to escalate, but enough to assert presence. Her voice was steady, deliberate, every word chosen like evidence in a trial. You saw what happened. We were targeted for no reason. We followed every instruction. We proved our identities. And yet, we were still questioned. That isn't drama. That's discrimination. The man laughed under his breath. Discrimination. That word gets thrown around every time someone doesn't get their way. Lila's breath quickened. She wanted to shout, to unleash all the anger bubbling inside her, but Naomi's hand brushed against hers, grounding her. Naomi leaned slightly forward, her eyes never leaving the man's. Do you really believe we would choose to be humiliated publicly? Do you think we enjoy being reduced to suspects for existing in a seat we paid for? The cabin had gone silent. Every passenger listening now, even Denise, lurking in the galley, peeked out, her expression unreadable. Margaret's voice rang out, crisp and firm. That's enough. She stood, her stature commanding the aisle. I watched everything. These young women did nothing wrong. What you call drama, I call courage. They stood their ground when injustice came for them, and I'll remind you that silence in the face of prejudice makes you complicit. The businessman shifted uncomfortably, his confidence wavering. I'm entitled to my opinion. Charles Benton spoke next, his tone measured but unyielding. Opinions are not shields for ignorance. What happened tonight wasn't perception. It was fact. I've argued cases built on less evidence than what every passenger in this cabin witnessed. You want to minimize it because acknowledging it makes you uncomfortable. But discomfort is not injustice. What happened to them is... Murmurs of agreement spread through the cabin. A woman in row 4 said softly, "They're right." Another passenger added, "I saw the flight attendant's tone. It wasn't the same with anyone else." Naomi felt a surge of something rare collective recognition. For once, the weight wasn't hers alone to carry. The businessman scowled but seemed to shrink into his seat. His power had evaporated in the face of truth spoken plainly. Naomi settled back into her chair, her heart still racing but her expression calm. Lila exhaled shakily, gripping her bracelet. Adrian approached cautiously, his voice quiet but firm. "Sir, I need to remind you that respectful behavior is required of all passengers. If this continues, the captain will be informed." The man muttered under his breath, but said nothing more. Naomi turned to Lila, her voice low. "See, we're not alone." Lila nodded, though tears prickled her eyes. The confrontation had cracked something open in her, a realization of how quickly people could reduce them to caricatures, but also how powerful it was when others refused to let that happen. Margaret returned to her seat, her eyes still fierce. She leaned slightly toward the sisters. "Never doubt the impact of speaking truth. Tonight, you've reminded everyone here of it," Naomi whispered back. "Thank you." For the rest of the cabin, the atmosphere had changed. Whispers now carried a different tone, curiosity mixed with reflection. Sympathy mingled with discomfort. Some passengers avoided the sisters' gaze, unwilling to confront their own complicity. Others looked at them with quiet respect. Lila leaned back, her voice barely audible. "Naomi, I don't know how you do it. I felt like I was going to break." Naomi took her sister's hand. "You don't have to be unbreakable. You just have to keep standing. That's enough." The hum of the engines filled the silence between them. The confrontation had left the cabin raw, but it had also shifted the balance. The sisters were no longer just two women fighting alone. They had drawn out allies, revealed truths, forced silence to shatter. Still, Naomi knew the night wasn't finished with them. The flight wasn't over, and battles had a way of resurfacing when least expected. She could already feel the weight of what awaited them on the ground: questions, headlines, scrutiny. But for now, in this suspended capsule of air, they had claimed a victory. As the plane soared onward through the dark sky, Naomi closed her eyes, whispering a phrase that felt like both memory and vow: "Justice always." Beside her, Lila whispered it too, their voices joining in quiet unison. The words settled in the cabin like a seed planted, waiting to grow. The plane soared high above the clouds, steady now. But inside the cabin the air remained charged. A confrontation like that did not dissolve easily. Naomi felt it humming beneath the silence, like an echo that refused to fade. Passengers shifted, some pretending to read, others glued to their seatback screens, though their eyes flickered now and then toward the sisters. Phones glowed faintly in the dim light, thumbs moving quickly. Naomi noticed the discreet angles at which a few people tilted their devices. She knew what that meant. Videos, posts. The story had already begun leaving the confines of the aircraft. Lila leaned closer, her whisper urgent. "Naomi, they're recording us. I can feel it." Naomi's jaw tightened. "Of course they are. This plane is no longer just a flight, it's a stage. We're the story, whether we chose it or not. Lila's stomach twisted. I didn't sign up to be a symbol tonight. Naomi's eyes softened. None of us ever sign up for it, but sometimes the fight chooses you. Across the aisle, Margaret Sinclair lowered her phone after typing a message. She caught Naomi's gaze and gave a reassuring nod. Charles Benton was still at his laptop, his fingers moving quickly, his face lit by the screen's glow. Naomi could almost guess what he was writing: facts, observations, legal language that might one day become testimony. Near the galley, Denise paced, her face pale but set with quiet fury. Naomi knew that look well. It was the look of someone who realized that they had lost control of the narrative. Claire Donovan had already reprimanded her. Her authority had cracked in front of the entire cabin. Denise wanted to reclaim it, but her silence betrayed that she couldn't find the ground to stand on. Adrian, in contrast, moved calmly through the aisle, offering water, checking on passengers. When he passed the sisters' row, he bent slightly. "Try to rest," he whispered. "The captain wants the cabin calm until we land. It won't be long now." Naomi nodded. Lila offered a faint smile, though her chest still ached with unease. She turned back to her sister. "What happens when we land?" Naomi exhaled slowly. "There will be questions. People will have already posted videos. The airline will scramble to protect itself. But the truth is, we don't control the first wave. We only control our response." Lila hugged her knees closer, whispering, "I'm not ready for that." Naomi looked at her with quiet intensity. Neither was Mom, neither was Dad, neither is anyone when it comes. But ready or not, it's here, and we'll face it together. Her words steadied Lila. She leaned her head against the cool glass of the window, staring out at the ocean of stars. She thought about her camera, tucked safely in her bag in the overhead bin. How she wished she could capture this moment, not the spectacle, but the texture of it. The way injustice and resilience sat side by side in the confined space of a cabin 30,000 feet above the earth. Behind them, a low murmur rose. Naomi caught fragments of conversation. They were treated unfairly. But did you see how the father handled it? This is going to be on the news. It struck Naomi how quickly strangers became narrators. Each passenger had lived the same scene, but each would carry a different version of it to the ground. Some would defend them. Others would dismiss them, but all would talk about them. The thought both terrified and emboldened her. Visibility was dangerous, but silence was worse. Lila whispered, "Do you think Dad is already on the phone with reporters?" Naomi gave a faint smile. "If I know him, yes. He doesn't wait for storms to pass. He calls them out while they're still raging." Lila's bracelet glinted in the faint light. She touched the engraved words again, "Justice always," and felt her mother's presence steadying her heartbeat. The plane entered smoother air, and the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our descent. Please fasten your seatbelts and prepare for landing." The cabin stirred awake. Seats clicked upright, trays locked, belongings tucked away. The normal rituals of arrival resumed, but the atmosphere was anything but routine. Everyone knew they were descending into something larger than an airport. Naomi straightened her blazer, her movements precise. She was already preparing herself for cameras, for microphones, for the questions she knew would come. Her breathing slowed, her face composed. She would not step off this plane looking broken. She would step off looking ready. Lila watched her sister and felt awe. Naomi carried herself like a mountain, immovable, steady, powerful. Lila wished she could borrow that strength, even for a moment. Naomi sensed her gaze. She turned and said softly, "You don't have to be me. You have to be you. That's enough." The words landed deeply. Lila realized her photographs were her strength, her way of speaking truth. Naomi's courtroom was built of law and language. Hers was built of images, different weapons, same war. The landing gear groaned beneath them. The cabin tilted. Lights glowing brighter now. Passengers braced, some gripping armrests, others closing eyes. The city below stretched out like a constellation, glittering against the night. As the plane touched down, tires screeching softly against the runway, the sisters exchanged a look. The real turbulence, they knew, was waiting on the ground. The plane slowed, engines roaring before settling into a low hum. Seat belts clicked open, bags tugged from bins, voices rising in anticipation of escape. But in the sisters' row, stillness lingered. Naomi and Lila sat quietly, preparing themselves. Margaret leaned across the aisle one last time. "Whatever happens out there, remember this: you've already won by not surrendering." Charles Benton closed his laptop and stood. He paused, glancing at the sisters. "If you need legal testimony, you know where to find me." Adrian passed by, his voice low. "Good luck, and thank you for reminding us that silence isn't neutral." The businessman who had sparked the confrontation avoided their eyes. His face red with shame or stubbornness, it was impossible to tell. The door of the plane opened, and the first passengers filed out. Naomi inhaled deeply, squaring her shoulders. Lila gripped her bracelet one last time, whispering under her breath, "Justice always." They rose together, step by step, moving toward the exit. The cabin that had once felt suffocating now felt like a crucible, a place that had tested them and left them changed. As they reached the doorway, Naomi glanced back briefly. The cabin looked ordinary again. Seats, screens, baggage racks, but she knew it wasn't ordinary. Not anymore. Stepping into the jet bridge, she felt the air shift, cooler, sharper. The echo of the cabin followed them. But so did something stronger. Resolve. The story had already left the plane. Now, so had they. The moment Naomi and Lila stepped off the plane, they knew the night was far from over. The air in the jet bridge was cooler than the cabin, but it carried the same weight of expectation, thick with tension. They could hear it even before they saw it: the murmur of voices, the click of cameras, the electric hum of anticipation waiting just beyond the gate. When the sisters emerged into the terminal, the scene struck them like a wave. Reporters stood clustered in a semicircle, their badges swinging from lanyards, microphones already raised. Flashbulbs popped, scattering bursts of light across the glossy floor. Travelers slowed their steps, pulling out phones, whispering to each other as the buzz of recognition rippled through the crowd. Naomi felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the courtroom nerves, but multiplied by chaos. She had prepared for battles before, but never one where the jury was the entire world. Lila, wide-eyed, froze for a moment. She clutched her bracelet so hard it pressed into her skin. She wasn't used to being the center of a storm. She had always hidden behind the lens of her camera, letting her work speak louder than her presence. Tonight, there was no lens to shield her. The first question came sharp and fast. slicing through the noise. "Naomi Carter. Lila Carter. Can you tell us what happened on the flight?" Another followed immediately. "Were you discriminated against because of your race?" And then another. "Is it true your father, Marcus Carter, intervened directly with the airline's leadership?" The questions tumbled over each other, reporters pushing forward, the swell of voices rising. Naomi raised a hand, her expression calm but commanding. The training of years in courtrooms kicked in control a room, even if the room is hostile. "We'll make a statement soon," she said firmly, "but right now, we've just come off a long flight, and my sister needs space. Please respect that." The firmness in her tone quieted the crowd, though the cameras kept flashing, the questions still murmuring under breath. Naomi took Lila's arm and guided her forward, moving through the crowd like a ship breaking waves. Marcus Carter stood waiting just beyond security, his tall frame unmistakable. His presence radiated authority, the kind that turned heads without effort. The moment he saw his daughters, his face softened, the worry lines around his eyes deepening. "Dad." Lila breathed, her voice breaking as she stepped into his embrace. Marcus held them both, his arms firm, grounding them in the middle of the chaos. "You did well," he murmured, his voice low enough for only them to hear. "You held your ground." Naomi pulled back slightly, her eyes searching his. "It's already out there. People were filming. Reporters are here. I know." Marcus said, "I've been on the phone since Claire called me. The airline's scrambling. They know they mishandled this, and now they're trying to get ahead of the story." Lila swallowed hard. "What does that mean for us?" Marcus looked at her with quiet determination. "It means you tell your truth before they twist it." He gestured toward the press that still lingered nearby. "You don't owe them everything right now, but you can't let silence become their weapon. Speak enough to be clear. The rest we'll handle together." Naomi nodded slowly. She turned to her sister, her voice steady. "Are you ready for this?" Lila's heart pounded. Her instincts screamed to run, to retreat into the comfort of anonymity. But when she saw her father's steady gaze and Naomi's unwavering calm, something shifted inside her. She realized she had already survived the humiliation in the cabin, already endured the turbulence of both sky and prejudice. Facing cameras couldn't be worse than that. "I'm ready," Lila whispered, though her hand still clutched the bracelet tightly. Marcus guided them to a small cluster of microphones where reporters leaned forward eagerly. Naomi stepped slightly ahead, her posture straight, her voice carrying over the noise. "Tonight," she began, "my sister and I boarded a flight like any other passenger. We bought our tickets. We followed every instruction. We showed every piece of identification asked of us, and yet we were treated as if our very presence in first class was a crime to be questioned." The terminal fell quiet. Even the casual travelers paused, ears straining to catch every word. Naomi continued, her tone calm but unyielding. "We were singled out. We were spoken to with suspicion, and when we asked for respect, we were met with hostility. That is not customer service. That is discrimination, and it has no place in the skies or anywhere." A reporter shouted, "What about your father's involvement? Did he force the airline to hold the plane?" Naomi's gaze did not falter. "Our father stood up for us when the system failed to. That is what any parent would do. But let me be clear. The issue tonight is not about power or influence. It is about dignity. Every passenger deserves to sit in their seat without having their belonging questioned because of the color of their skin. Applause broke unexpectedly from somewhere in the crowd. A few travelers clapped softly, their sound swelling into something louder. Reporters glanced around, surprised, but the clapping continued until it became a ripple of solidarity through the terminal. Naomi let the sound carry before she stepped back, signaling the statement was over. Lila hadn't spoken, but she didn't need to. Standing there beside her sister, her hand wrapped around her bracelet, her face steady in the glow of cameras that was statement enough, Marcus guided them toward a waiting car, shielding them from the crush of questions. As the door closed and the noise of the terminal faded behind them, the sisters finally exhaled. Lila leaned back against the seat, her voice small. "I was so scared." Marcus reached across, taking her hand. "Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's what you do with it." Naomi looked out the window, watching the blur of lights slide past. She knew this was just the beginning. The flight had been the spark, but now the fire was spreading. The airline would issue statements, the media would spin angles, and the world would debate their experience as if it were theory, not their lived reality. But she also knew something else: they were not alone anymore. The echoes of their story were already moving outward, beyond their control, yes, but also beyond their silence. And in that realization, Naomi felt not fear, but resolve. By the time Naomi and Lila reached their hotel, the story had already gone national. Screens in the lobby glowed with breaking news banners. Sisters removed from first-class spark controversy. Clips from shaky passenger cell phone videos looped on 24-hour channels. The sisters' faces frozen mid-sentence, their voices reduced to sound bites. Naomi caught the headlines scrolling across the bottom of the screen: "Airline investigates incident," "Civil rights leaders speak out," and then, inevitably, the counterweight critics call it overreaction. It was surreal, watching their reality repackaged into talking points before they'd even had time to process what had happened. Lila stood in the center of the lobby, her eyes locked on the television. Her own voice echoed back to her, sharp with frustration. The tone of her plea caught forever on someone's phone. She hugged herself tightly. "They're dissecting us like we're not even real people." Naomi placed a hand on her shoulder. "That's what the media does. They turn moments into narratives. But we still own the truth. Don't forget that." Marcus checked them in quietly, his face unreadable. Years in boardrooms had taught him to keep his expression still even when storms raged inside. But Naomi knew her father. She saw the flicker in his eyes every time a pundit dismissed the incident as miscommunication or overblown. Upstairs in their suite, the glow of multiple screens felt oppressive. News anchors debated the incident as though it were a case study. One commentator leaned forward, his voice laced with skepticism. "We don't know all the details. Perhaps the flight crew had reason to ask questions. We shouldn't assume discrimination every time someone feels uncomfortable." Lila snapped the remote off, her chest tight. Uncomfortable. Is that what they think this is? That being humiliated, accused, and treated like criminals is just discomfort? Her voice cracked, and she pressed her face into her hands. Naomi moved beside her, pulling her into an embrace. Let them talk. They don't get the final word. But even Naomi, steady as she was, felt the weight of the backlash. She had seen it before, how quickly righteous anger could be reframed as entitlement. how easily the burden of proof was shifted onto the victims. Her mind raced with legal arguments, precedents, strategies. She wanted to fight back with precision, but tonight she felt the exhaustion of simply being forced to prove, once again, that their humanity was not up for debate. Marcus finally broke the silence. The airline's executives are meeting in the morning. They'll issue an apology, maybe announce some review of policies. But don't be fooled. Their priority isn't justice, it's damage control. Naomi nodded. Then we make sure damage control isn't enough. They need accountability, not spin. Lila leaned back against the couch cushions, her eyes glassy. I didn't ask to be a symbol. Naomi, I just wanted to take a flight. I wanted to sit in my seat, drink my water, maybe fall asleep against the window. I didn't want this. Her words were raw, stripped of composure. Naomi brushed a strand of hair from her sister's face. I know. None of us wanted this. But we don't get to choose the battles sometimes. We only get to choose how we fight them. Later that night, when the city had quieted and even the television murmurs felt distant, Lila sat alone by the window. The lights stretched out endlessly, tiny constellations scattered across the ground. She thought about the comments already flooding social media, some supportive, others venomous. Strangers had turned her into either a hero or a villain, a rallying cry or a target. She felt reduced to roles she had never asked for. Her camera lay on the table beside her. She picked it up almost instinctively, adjusting the lens, framing the skyline. When she clicked the shutter, the sound grounded her. This was her language, her way of making sense of chaos. Through the lens, she could choose what to focus on. Naomi joined her quietly, setting down 2 mugs of tea. Couldn't sleep. Lila shook her head. Every time I close my eyes, I hear their voices, the flight attendant's suspicion, that man in first class saying we thrive on drama, the reporters shouting questions like we were on trial. It's too loud in my head. Naomi sipped her tea. I know that noise. It doesn't go away overnight, but it will become fuel if you let it. Lila lowered her camera, her eyes searching Naomi's. Doesn't it ever scare you that speaking out could make us targets? Naomi exhaled slowly, her gaze steady, all the time. But being silent scares me more, because silence lets them win without a fight. For a long moment, the sisters sat in silence, the weight of their reality heavy between them. Yet beneath it, something unspoken passed through a bond forged not only by blood, but by shared struggle. The next morning, the world outside their hotel had already shifted. Protesters gathered outside the airline's headquarters, holding signs that read, "Justice always and flying," while black is not a crime. News vans lined the street. Hashtags trended across social platforms, carrying their names into conversations in homes and offices across the country. Marcus stood at the window, watching the growing crowd. His face was grave, but his voice carried quiet pride. You've started something bigger than this flight, bigger than this airline. Naomi joined him, her arms folded. That means they'll fight harder to shut it down. Lila lingered behind them, staring at her bracelet. The engraving gleamed in the morning light. Justice always. She whispered the words to herself, testing their strength. The doorbell rang, breaking the stillness. When Naomi opened it, a hotel staff member stood holding a stack of letters and packages. "These arrived for you," he said. Inside were handwritten notes, messages of support, even drawings from children who had seen the news with their parents. Lila's hands trembled as she flipped through them. One note, written in careful crayon letters, read, "Thank you for being brave." "I want to be brave too." Tears stung her eyes. "Naomi, they're watching us, not just the reporters, kids, families, people who need to know it's possible to stand up." Naomi smiled gently. "That's the part they don't show on TV, the ripples you can't measure." But just as the support poured in, so did the backlash. Online, vitriol spread with the same speed as solidarity, accusations of entitlement, of playing the race card, of seeking attention. Strangers dissected their lives as if truth could be extracted through cruelty. Lila flinched at the harsh words, but Naomi steadied her. "Hate is loud, but so is hope. Don't let one drown out the other." That night, as the city pulsed with noise, the sisters sat together on the balcony of their suite. Naomi's voice was soft but unwavering. "We're not just fighting for ourselves anymore. We're fighting for everyone who doesn't get a camera when it happens to them. That's why this matters." Lila nodded, her camera resting in her lap. "Then we keep fighting, no matter how loud it gets." The storm of backlash swirled around them, but in that quiet moment, Naomi and Lila felt anchored. The world might twist their story, but they still owned their truth, and with that, they found their strength again. Morning sunlight spilled through the curtains, soft and golden, as if the world itself wanted to offer peace after days of turbulence. Naomi Carter stood at the window of their suite, sipping coffee that had long gone cold. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass, composed yet undeniably weary. Behind her, Lila sat cross-legged on the bed, sifting through stacks of messages they had received overnight. Some were printed tweets, others emails, and still more handwritten letters that hotel staff continued to deliver. She read them one by one, her lips moving silently, words of encouragement, stories from strangers who had lived similar humiliations, promises of solidarity. Marcus Carter entered quietly, carrying the morning paper under his arm. He set it on the table without a word, but the headline blared loudly enough: "Carter Sisters Spark National Reckoning." Beneath it was a photo taken at the airport the night before. Naomi at the microphone, Lila beside her clutching her bracelet, Marcus a steady presence at their side. Lila looked up. "They're calling it a reckoning? That feels so heavy, like we're supposed to fix everything." Naomi turned from the window, her expression softening. "We're not supposed to fix everything. We're supposed to tell the truth. That's what we did. The rest, it ripples outward." Marcus nodded in agreement. Movements don't begin with solutions. They begin with people refusing to stay silent. You've done that. You've already changed the conversation. But Naomi's mind churned with both relief and caution. She knew public memory could be short. Today, people rallied in their support. Tomorrow, the news cycle might move on, leaving the deeper issues unaddressed. The true test would not be in the headlines, but in what followed once the cameras left. Later that afternoon, the sisters were invited to a press conference where the airline's leadership planned to address the incident. It was staged in a sterile conference hall, rows of cameras and journalists already in place when they arrived. Naomi could sense the choreography. The airline intended a carefully crafted apology, promises of training, and perhaps an announcement of a new diversity initiative. Claire Donovan, the executive who had confronted Denise on the plane, stepped to the podium. Her expression was grave, her tone deliberate. On behalf of the airline, I want to offer a formal apology to Naomi and Lila Carter. What happened on Flight 237 should never have occurred. It was unacceptable. We take full responsibility." She paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. "Effective immediately. We're launching a review of our policies and mandatory training for all staff to ensure that bias, conscious or unconscious, has no place in our service. We are also placing the attendant involved, Denise Walsh, on indefinite leave pending further review." Flashes erupted from the cameras. Questions flew, but Claire raised her hand, signaling she would take only a few. Her answers were polished, careful, corporate. It was the apology they had expected, but Naomi noticed something different this time. The words were not just performance. Claire's eyes carried a weight of sincerity, as though the night in the cabin had shifted something in her as well. After the executives stepped down, reporters turned eagerly to the sisters. Naomi approached the microphones, her heart steady. She did not want this moment to dissolve into hollow statements. "My sister and I accept this apology," she began, her voice calm but strong. "But an apology is not the end. It is the beginning. Discrimination doesn't vanish with a press release. It requires vigilance, accountability, and courage. We will hold this airline to its promises, and we ask the public to do the same. Because what happened to us is not unique. It happens quietly, every day, to people without cameras, without headlines. This moment is for them too." She stepped back, and to her surprise, Lila moved forward. Her hands shook slightly, but she lifted her chin. "I'm not a lawyer," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I'm an artist. I take pictures because sometimes words can't carry everything. But last night, sitting on that plane, I realized something. Injustice feels invisible until it touches you. Then it's all you can see. We can't let it stay invisible anymore. Not for us. Not for anyone." The room fell silent. For once, reporters had no questions. Cameras clicked, but the stillness carried more weight than the noise. Afterward, as they left the hall, Naomi placed an arm around her sister's shoulders. "You were brilliant," she whispered. Lila smiled faintly. "I was terrified." "Courage," Naomi said, "is always terrified." That evening, back at the hotel, they finally found a moment of quiet. Marcus poured 3 glasses of wine, raising his in a small toast. "To Evelyn," he said, invoking their mother's name. The sisters lifted their glasses too, their eyes misting. "To justice always," Naomi added. "To justice always," Lila echoed, clutching her bracelet as she spoke the words aloud. For the first time in days, laughter returned to their voices, small and tentative but real. They told stories of their mother's resilience, of her ability to face injustice with both fierceness and grace. They remembered her insistence that dignity was not something given, but something claimed. As night settled over the city, Naomi sat once more by the window, watching the lights scatter like constellations. Lila joined her, camera in hand. She snapped a photo of the skyline, then another of her sister's reflection in the glass. "What are you capturing?" Naomi asked, amused. "The moment we realized we weren't broken," Lila replied softly. Naomi smiled. "Good, because we're not. The story of that flight would live on in headlines, in hashtags, in debates across living rooms and classrooms. But for Naomi and Lila, it lived most powerfully in this quiet truth: they had faced the storm, and they had not bowed. The echoes of injustice were still loud, But now their voices were louder, and that, they knew, was how change began. As the engines quieted and the cameras dimmed, Naomi and Lila Carter left us with more than a headline. They left us with a mirror. Their story is not only about two sisters removed from first class, it is about every invisible battle fought in silence. Every moment dignity is questioned. Every injustice brushed aside as a misunderstanding. We are reminded that love and resilience are powerful weapons, that the bond of family, the echo of a mother's wisdom, and the courage to speak when silence is easier can shake entire systems. But we are also reminded of what must change. Discrimination, whether loud or subtle, whether in the skies or on the ground, has no place in a world that dares to call itself just. As you close this chapter, ask yourself, what would you do if it were you or your family sitting in that seat? Would you speak up? Would you stand firm? Would you demand justice? Let us carry their story forward with love, with outrage, with hope. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because together we can keep these voices alive, and there are more stories to tell.